Welcome, everybody, to the Scoring Notes podcast, the video version, if you're watching this on video. I'm Philip Rothman.
And I'm David McDonald.
And we are here at the 2025 MOLA conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Of course, we talk all about music notation software and related technology. You and I do, David, on a regular basis. But here we're talking about a related profession, music librarians.
And music librarians use so many of the tools that are exactly the same ones that we use in music preparation and composition and teaching. They use some of them in slightly different ways, but a lot of them in exactly the same way. So we work with librarians a lot as preparers and composers and teachers. We work with these people on a regular basis as well.
Yes, we do.
This is the one time of year we get to see them in person.
And it is often the one time of the year that I get to see you in person.
It is.
So it's great to see you, my friend.
Likewise.
And all of our collaborations over the years. And it has been a number of years. And you and I have basically been attending these conferences pretty much as long as we've been doing the podcast. This is our fifth MOLA conference, if you can believe it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. If we count the one on Zoom. Yeah.
We count the virtual one in 2021. There was the one in Philadelphia in 2022. Of course, Berlin, Germany.
Sure.
We were both there in 23. Last year, you and I were just up I-90 in Cleveland, Ohio. And we're here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the interesting thing is that with MOLA, other than the virtual one, of course,
right.
It's always been hosted by a professional orchestra. In fact, MOLA, for those of you that aren't aware, actually started out as the Major Orchestra Librarians Association when it was first founded in 1983. But of course, now it has expanded way beyond the professional orchestras. And in fact, beyond orchestras, as an ensemble, there are other performance librarians, and the official name of MOLA is now an association of performance librarians. So I think it's really fitting, actually. I learned that this is the first MOLA conference that is being held, hosted not by a professional orchestra, but by a university.
I think that's really interesting because obviously universities are where I have spent most of my career. And when I tell my colleagues that I'm going to this library conference, they think research librarians,
Sure.
right? Because a place like the University of Michigan, where we're sitting right now, has both a very large research library that still has music and music adjacent materials, but then they also have a performance library. And I think it's a really interesting kind of performance library. We've heard talks at previous MOLA conferences about the slightly different role of performance librarians in music schools, because they're serving a much larger number of ensembles. Those people in the ensembles are maybe professional quality performers, but they're students and they have different sets of responsibilities than a professional musician might. And they have a different kind of team and just a different kind of environment and context that they work in. I think it's a really interesting kind of set of differences between the way a performance librarian works in a music school compared to in a professional ensemble. It's been interesting to talk to people who do those kinds of things here.
Can you recall any type of conversation, any specific conversation that you had along those lines here? Not to put you on the spot.
Sure.
But,
well, I mean, I was in a session just yesterday. I went to a session. I don't know if we want to get into the specific session talks just yet.
We'll get to it a little bit later, but
with in the different hats that librarians wear, and one of the panelists was Meredith Gangler from Eastman, and she was talking about how a lot of her responsibilities go much more into kind of managing people in the ensembles, and also to some extent the ensemble directors and conductors, just because of the nature of the environment. There's a little bit more kind of leadership role outside of just the library that she has. And while that is maybe not specific to that circumstance, I think it's probably more common in the context of a university than it would be in other places.
It totally makes sense, because the librarian is a staff member, I guess a staff member, but someone in a professional paid position that is really, different than the students who are very much not that. Whereas in a professional context, librarians are, in many cases, part of the collective bargaining agreement, part of the orchestra itself. And so they're peers. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, even though librarians, I'm sure there are times, even in a professional context, where they assume a leadership role for one reason or another. In the university setting, it is very much more the case. Yeah,
it's definitely a different dynamic. There's more of a divide between the performers who are students and the people who are professionals being paid to be there.
Yeah. The other thing I've heard from my colleagues and friends that are librarians in the academic setting, the university setting, is that it's not uncommon to have 5, 10, a dozen work study students at any given time, which is actually great because a lot of those work study students actually discover music librarianship for the first time, and then have, in some cases, actually gone on to careers because there's no, you can't go to school to be a music librarian, an orchestra librarian, certainly. You can, there are degrees in library science and that sort of thing, but not what we're talking about here, which is a professional performance librarian. So I think
it's one of the really interesting things about MOLA is talking to different people about how they got into performance librarianship, because there's, like you said, there's no direct path. And the other thing that I love about it is that everyone here is a musician.
Yes.
And a lot of them have experience performing. Many of them still perform either in the ensembles that they work with as librarians or in other ensembles. And I think that's really fun to chat with those people about those experiences as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to... we will name drop one of those just because we had dinner with him the first night we were here, Hank Skolnick. He got into it. He's one of the librarians at the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, and he got into this business as a bassoonist and creating bespoke editions of bassoon music in Florida. And then one thing led to another, and he moved to St. Louis, and that, he kind of...
Tale as old as time.
Yes. Who among us has not got into the business creating obscure bassoon editions of, but you're right. I mean, that was his in, and he actually told us that he often for quite some time was one of the few specialty contrabassoonists on call, and he would do a gig if an orchestra didn't have a contrabassoonist handy and they needed somebody to play a concert. He would fly wherever, all over the place. Have contrabassoon will travel. But yeah, you're right, and they're bringing that experience to bear. I think in their experience as a librarian, I'm sure. Their musician colleagues, their performer colleagues are very appreciative of that. So, but as you said, there are librarians here. They're all musicians from all over the world, really, even though we're here in the U.S., but from many different places all around the world. There are, of course, also vendors, publishers, and even other people like composers and performers and administrators. Certainly, if they're coming to speak in a guest context, we see other people. They've had lawyers here and other times as well. Lots of people that can speak to the needs and the issues that professional librarians often deal with. So we're actually here. We're actually recording on the third day. The conference isn't even over yet. There's a whole other day. But I really think this is a unique opportunity for people in this profession who really often are the only person in their role at their organization, or maybe one of 2 or 3 in some of the larger orchestras. It's really great to see everybody commingle and share their lived experience and their tips and tricks, and sometimes they just get to. I think there are a couple sessions where it's pretty explicitly said in the program notes of the program that we have here that they just together just to vent, and that can be very helpful in its own right.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, they don't work so directly with so many people that will understand their concerns on a regular basis, and so there's a lot of kind of venting and kind of group therapy that happens in a place like this, and it's wonderful. I love being there for that too.
Yeah, it is because the job is so specific and so detail oriented, like many jobs, but especially, I mean, we were talking with our colleague John Barron from Steinberg, and we'll get to that a little bit more in just a second. But he said when he went through customs and they asked him because he was coming from the UK, what is it that you're here for? And he said, you'll never guess what this is. You'll never believe it. First of all, I wouldn't advise improvising at the customs point at passport control, but John is John, and he said, I'm here with a conference of orchestra librarians, and that's the truth. And so they let him through. Who knows if they'll let him back, but that's...
I'm sure he's on a list now.
Yeah. So speaking of that, the first day of the 4-day conference, as I said, we're in the third day, but the first day was the tech fair, as it has been for the past 3 years. And this year, running concurrently, there was also a pre-conference workshop that was geared towards newer librarians, which it sounded interesting, but since we were both involved with the tech fair, I didn't really get a sense of what that was like. Did you hear anything?
I did not.
Okay. All right. Well, if you know anyone that attended, you can ask them about that. But that was going on simultaneously with the tech fair. So that was a nice thing that the University of Michigan has a lot of space to offer. And so there were different rooms that were used for different things. But with respect to the tech fair, David, I was thinking that this may have been the end of, if we want to put a technology spin on it, Tech Fair 1.0. And what I mean by this is that this is really the culmination of an effort that stretched, I'd say, way more than even a decade ago, beginning with even the way I got into MOLA was the president at the time in 2014, Pat McGinn, who was the librarian at the Milwaukee Symphony. He approached me through my colleague, Paul Beck, who was a mutual friend and colleague, and said, we'd really like to get the librarians understanding how to use Finale and Sibelius. And can you come and, talking to me, can I come and give a couple of sessions on Finale and Sibelius? That was in Miami Beach with the New World Symphony. They were the host at the time in 2014. And he thought it was important that even if they don't know how to use the software, they should at least be aware of what it is and what it could do, which, believe it or not, that was a stretch at the time. Yeah. So that was the kind of the first, I think, real push into the tech world. And then Tony Rickard from the Royal Opera House in the UK, he really accelerated things in 2016. There wasn't a tech fair, but it was very tech heavy. That conference was hosted in Helsinki with those orchestras. And that was, I think, really a way of showing people, and I think a lot of light bulbs went off at the time and said, hey, yeah, this can really be a really important part of MOLA going forward. And of course, we saw Dorico. Daniel Spreadbury was there. He introduced, that was where Dorico was actually publicly revealed for the first time.
Before it was even available to anybody, probably before most of the beta testing had begun with external beta testers.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah, it was still several more months before it was actually released. And then, that conference was in the spring of that year in 2016. And then we finally, the trajectory continued with a full-blown tech fair for the first time in 2023 rather. We saw that next step, and Georgina Govier was instrumental in that effort. Another key player in this was John Rosenkrantz from the Chicago Lyric Opera. These are all opera librarians, actually. It's interesting, isn't it, that those were the ones that were really pushing the tech. But John Rosenkrantz, he actually was the one who initiated the formation of the MOLA Technology Committee. Right. And previously, there was no such committee devoted to technology. So it's kind of a reminder that even though technology, we often think of it moving very rapidly, sometimes these changes, especially at an institutional level, can take a lot of time, and they iterate over time. But what I mean by it being kind of the end of 1.0 is that you are now seeing, I think, the vast majority of librarians, regardless of their age, but especially ones that are on the younger side and have just grown up with technology. It's just part of what they do. Right. And so it'll be interesting, I think, if the tech fair comes back in the future, that it will be probably something very different than what these first few years have been. And this was kind of I feel like this was a nice chapter, almost a nice bookend to the 2014 beginning of that.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what happens next. I don't know if you have any sense from talking to anyone here, or your much longer experience with the MOLA conferences than I have. If you have any sense of what happens next. Next year's conference, we should say, is hosted by the Sydney Symphony Orchestra in Sydney, Australia.
Yes.
So, it'll probably be a very different set of attendees.
Yeah.
I imagine there are a lot of
there may be more
MOLA
people
members who can't come to Ann Arbor that would love to go to Sydney, and a lot of the inverse as well. A lot of people who are here right now in Ann Arbor who won't be able to make it to Australia next year.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how things move forward.
Yeah, I think that as well. And I think it's a little too early to see, but I think tech will continue to play some role, a very important role in the MOLA organization going forward. And that's really a testament to all those efforts of all those people and more, certainly over that time, who have been so instrumental in it. But to the tech fair here this year, there was a tech fair. And actually, David, you started it off with several of your colleagues in a session called Practical Technologies. You want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that was a session that I think is one of these sessions that comes about from the surveys that happen at the end of the conference that they use to prepare for the next year's conference. And, a lot of one of the interesting things about a tech fair at a conference like this is that the thing that we're all ostensibly serving, the performance of, live, mostly acoustic music, it doesn't really require technology, but all of the systems that support it now do. And so there are some very kind of direct ways of thinking about the relationship of technology and mostly classical music. But most of the things that we talk about, notation software is obviously the big example, is really in some ways beside the point. And what a lot of the thing that gets kind of skipped over in that conversation is all of the organizational work that leads up to what we do, and all of the small things that don't need music-specific software. So a lot of things we do involve databases to manage a collection of things in a library, or databases to manage the works that are needed to be assembled for a season of performances or a festival, or the project management, especially when it comes to working with a team, even if that team is one librarian plus the other performers who support the library, or the management who works with the library to plan the marketing for the season or something like that. There are all of these different touch points where everybody needs to be on the same page. And the easiest way to do that, or I suppose the most common way to do that, is some kind of technology tool. And everybody's technology stack is really different. And so in that session on practical technology in the music library, we spent a lot of time kind of talking about the different ways to approach thinking about your technology stack, how to decide what is the best tool for you, for your library, and for the people that you work with organizing things. How much time do you want to spend digging into and setting up a big system versus grabbing something off the shelf that may cost a bit more money, but is already kind of more tailor-made to the kind of work that you're doing. And then, of course, how you work with your colleagues and how you get everybody else up to speed on using this system that you have implemented, and how you set people up for success after you're hands off on a project. And I think that was really interesting. It started to veer toward in some places, what you were saying earlier is kind of a venting session or a group therapy session, because everyone has these emotional scars of trying to implement things that kind of blew up. But it was very interesting to see how everyone is using kind of really common things like a spreadsheet to serve really complex roles. And I think one of the most interesting things that I saw was different ways of using online services, a lot of web services that I was seeing, because so much of what we do is collaborative, and we need to be able to access it on work devices, on personal devices, and everybody needs to be able to kind of contribute something to it. It can't just be something that lives only on my computer. It has to be something that lives in some place that everybody can get to it.
Yeah. That's a good point. And that was a takeaway that I found particularly striking, because especially with these orchestras, again, we mentioned that the librarian is often the one person in that role, and yet they do have to share details of, when did the music come in? When is it ready? When is it going to be available for the rehearsal? When is it due back? Who's checked it out? And so on and so forth. And the types of systems that might be designed from a general IT perspective just aren't going to, you're going to really have to do a lot of work to try to get them to work the way that you would really want. Or you could, as one of your colleagues on the panel, Jean Etienne from Columbus Symphony Orchestra, that's Johnny Etienne Lederer is his full name. He was using Google Sheets and using but using it in a relational way, where he had kind of his master spreadsheet, but then he had another spreadsheet that he was using that was for public consumption, public viewing, and it was referencing only certain cells or certain rows, certain columns of that spreadsheet, because he was keeping other things in that one master spreadsheet. But the point is, he was only using one spreadsheet for everything, and then he was able to kind of siphon off, if certain people just need this view or certain people need this view, you can do that. And that was a very, I wouldn't call it a low-tech solution, but it was a practical.
It's very practical
technology.
Right? Yeah. And I think the thing that he kind of started us thinking about that was that this is the solution to the problem of him getting emails or people interrupting him every 5 to 10 minutes saying, "Hey, is the music ready yet? Hey, is the music ready yet? Hey, is the music ready yet?" Like, no, just look at this thing and it will tell you if the music is ready yet. Yeah. And that, I think, is really powerful. He said something about this, and Joshua Ludi from the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, friend of the show, Joshua Ludi, that kind of rang true to me in a lot of different work contexts that I have, is when something like that is happening over and over again and is causing you to do kind of redundant work. That's the point at which you want to try to find some kind of solution to avoid some degree of that redundancy. I don't think there's a way that we can remove all of the redundancy from our jobs, but as much as we can, then we can focus on the things that really require focus and attention and thought and care. Yeah. And the things that don't require as much focus and attention and thought and care, like, no, the music isn't ready yet, send. That, I think, saves a lot of our just mental and emotional capacity for the things that really require it.
And, you've mentioned on the podcast before the bus problem. Like, what happens if I get hit by a bus? God forbid. But he mentioned something kind of like that, where they were thrown a last minute concert series that they needed to devote their full attention to. And basically everything else was pretty much put on hold. But those things still needed to happen, like music needed to get a return and contracts needed to be signed and this and that. And so he needed to be able to set up a system where other people could access it and just jump in and know what was going on. And that's another, and really there's no one technological solution. There's no one product. It's really whatever fits at your organization or your particular workflow or whatever. But the point was, don't make it so complicated and controlled access. You obviously have to have security so that it's just not open, but there is that balance. And that's something that I think a lot of people are finding right now.
Yes, and that reminds me, there's one other thing that I think is one of the really interesting takeaways that I had from the session, and that was something that Julia Karstens from the Virginia Symphony Orchestra mentioned. And I should have said this earlier, Julia really was the one who, I moderated the panel, but Julia really did all of the heavy lifting to organize the thoughts and organize the people in planning the session. She did so much important work for us, that she has this great system of a handbook that's the kind of the library handbook. And at the beginning of a season, she said she prints off a paper copy of this handbook. And then throughout the season, when she finds either things that she wants to change or things that are maybe missing from the handbook or could be explained better or differently in the handbook, she makes a note on the paper copy. And then in between seasons, when she's kind of wrapping up everything from the last season to prepare for the next season, she'll then re-enter all of that stuff, retype all of that stuff back into the digital copy and print off a new copy to start the year. I think that's a really great, first of all, having a handbook at all. Yeah. I imagine there are a lot of people who listen to the program, and even a lot of people here at MOLA, especially solo librarians, may not have a handbook because they hold everything in their head.
Yeah.
And I think the idea of a handbook in some form, whether that is something on paper that you keep or some kind of online documentation that's a living document that you update all the time, is a fantastic idea. And I think a lot of organizations, not just libraries, but music schools, certainly we have handbooks, but they could be better, that could really learn from.
It reminds me of what some of the giants in our field have told us. I'm thinking of Emily Grishman. I'm thinking of Katie Wardrobe, super organized, super busy people who do that very thing. And it's not super high tech. It is basically a text document.
Right.
And, but when something comes up, they make a note of it and they organize it, of course. And that way it's there and they know how to reference it so that they're not constantly, as you said, holding it in their head. So that's a very, very good, way to not go crazy when you're dealing with, the type of seasons that these orchestras have to deal with, where it's just pedal to the metal the whole time.
And certainly those of us that work with publishers from time to time are familiar with the idea of a style guide that is a written document that a publisher might have. And in some ways, this is like a style guide for everything else, right?
Yes. Right.
It's a style guide for everything off the page in some ways, right?
Yeah, and then you just use the library manager or the house style manager to import it into.
The library manager right there, you just drag the old handbook on top of the other one and it's exactly.
Shows you the differences. That's a Dorico reference or a Sibelius reference for that matter. For those of you that use those softwares, products know what we're talking about. But speaking of that, in the middle part of the day, there were various product demonstrations. There was Dorico, Music, Score Music, Demusco, and we've actually covered all those products before here. And but it was nice that they had basically uninterrupted time to give the assembled delegates here a taste of their product and what it can do, and then invite people to come to their booths to learn more and have more one-on-one demonstrations. But then at the end of the day, we had a session about finale, or rather life after finale.
The kind of the postlude, the coda,
coda music technology.
Oh no, I didn't even mean that pun.
Yes. It's too bad that they named it that, because it was foreshadowing. But no, the reason is because Phil Farron said it was going to be the last program he would ever write, because he wasn't a music programmer, and that's why he called it finale. Fun fact. Anyway, true. But anyway, so as the participants, the aforementioned John Barron, the international product specialist from Dorico for Steinberg. And then my other guest was Corey Davis. He's the editor and production manager at Dunvegan Music Publishers, and they handle Philip Glass's music and many other sub-publishers, or I should say there are other sub-publishers that handle many other composers within that whole operation, but he's primarily concerned with that. And, so we were talking about life after finale. That was the subject. And the news, of course, is not a surprise for any regular Scoring Notes followers who know what the news is, that finale is sunsetting. They announced that last year in August. And there's the cross grade to Dorico. That's official. And then Avid, of course, also responded with a cross grade offer of their own. And we saw various product updates among Sibelius, Dorico, MuseScore to kind of capture the finale market, introduce some finale-like features. That, of course, if you're listening to the Scoring Notes and you're not listening for the first time, you know all that. But I think it was very important and news to a lot of the people in the audience who, again, kind of had their head down all season. And then it's like, what? Finale? I mean, maybe they heard that finale is going away. I had several people ask me, how do I convert finale to Dorico? And, of course, you and I know the answer to that. It's Music XML. But what was, I think I saw a lot of light bulbs go off when people realized that if they hadn't upgraded Finale in several years and then were kind of bowled over by the news that Finale was going away and they couldn't access the latest upgrade, that they actually can still get Finale 27.4.1, which is the last version of Finale, as long as they purchase that Dorico Crossgrade. And then Make Music will also give you for nothing extra the latest version of Finale, so that you can get access to the latest version of Music XML that was included in Finale, Music XML 4.0. So that was, I think, a really good piece of practical advice that we could give people in the library, whether they use their own Finale files or whether that they're passing that knowledge on to whoever they work with. I took an informal poll of the group. This is thoroughly unscientific and maybe not representative of the entire music notation market, but it was interesting. Didn't you think that it was roughly a third between, among Finale, Dorico, and Sibelius, a couple MuseScore users as well. But I asked, what is your primary, if you use music notation software, what is your primary program? And that was interesting. I expect we'll continue to see that change over time.
And I wonder if that split is because we were specifically at the tech fair. Mm-hmm. And these are people who, like most librarians, they have kind of their real job to do. They don't necessarily explore new software recreationally like some of us do. When there's a new thing, I want to try it and play with it. I want to click all the buttons. I want to see if I can make it go bloop. And not everyone is like that. And I think the people who tend to be more like you and me, who would play with a new tool just to see what it does, are the people who would come to the tech fair. And so I think that's one of the reasons why that session was so important, mm-hmm. because librarians have a lot of things on their plate.
True.
And they probably saw the news about Finale. They would have gotten emails or heard about it from a colleague, but they probably have not had time to really do anything about it, mm-hmm. Because it would have happened right at the start of their season.
Right.
And they, like a lot of us, would have thousands of files, and probably a lot of them are like 4 measures for an insert somewhere, right? Not all of them are going to be 3-act operas, mm-hmm. but they have thousands of these files, and they need to decide if this is a thing they need to do something about, or if it's a thing they can ignore, and if it's a thing they need to do something about, how and how much and when.
Right.
And so I think that's why the session that you ran on Friday afternoon was really important to this particular group of people, and they seemed very appreciative of it. I don't know if did you talk to anybody afterwards?
Yes, yeah, very much so. No, something I'm very keen on is making sure that librarians are aware that of all the things that music notation software can do, apart from creating notes on the page. And one of those things actually is Dorico 6's new proofreading feature. I feel like that was actually tailor-made for librarians in many respects. It's a lot of the things that they do already: checking for redundancies, checking for missing time signatures, checking for a missing dynamic, checking for a bad instrument change.
I saw a lot of in John Barron's demonstration. I saw a lot of really bug eyes at some of those features, because who among us has not changed an order of things and forgotten to put a dynamic at the alto flute entrance or something, right? Of course,
yeah. Well, I mean, and I have to say, I didn't really fully realize how valuable a tool that could be for librarians. And I have to say, even though we're talking about Dorico 6's new proofreading features, a lot of those same tools exist in Sibelius as a suite of plugins. It doesn't do it in real time the way Dorico does. You have to run a plugin and so on and so forth. But you can check for all those things that I just mentioned a moment ago, and much, much more. And I was talking to another librarian who uses Sibelius, and he does a lot of copy work. And he was not aware of those plugins. We were talking about something called Find Irregular and Misfilled Bars, which tells you whether or not the correct number of beats is in the bar relative to the time signature. And I showed him, and of course he was checking for all those things manually before, and the software will always find those things. And then you can decide what to do, whether you want to ignore it or fix it or whatever. So I feel like just educating and making, illuminating the librarians about those aspects of the music notation software, and not just the things that we're all familiar with it, was something that was very helpful.
And for people with a lot of different responsibilities, having an automated way to tell you, hey, you've got a redundant key signature or something, that frees up however much time you would have spent checking for that to do other really important things.
Yes, exactly. No, and I always, as you know, I also have my whole library service myself as a publishing agent for many composers. And I always am, I'm so sad really when I get the parts back and I see that somebody has manually created on their own time and their own dime an insert because they felt that maybe they got a request from a clarinet player that they wanted a certain passage in B flat as opposed to A or vice versa. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they had just asked, surely even the lag time it would have taken to respond to the email and all that, the actual time of doing that in Sibelius or Dorico or Finale would have been trivial compared to probably the hours that they spent having to re-entering it. Yeah, and matching the layout and all of the
set. Be error prone, right?
Yeah, and be error prone, of course, yeah. And so we have tutorials on that, on scoring notes, as you know. So things like that, I feel that was in the context of where to go after Finale, whether you continue, and we also talked about why you might want to use Finale for at least a little bit longer, depending on, what you do. And we talked about, hey, you don't need to necessarily go and convert 100% of your Finale files to Dorico.
Right.
You might want to talk about backing them up to Music XML or PDF. And I think you and I, and probably most of our scoring notes listeners know what those file formats do. But I think it was important for the librarians to understand, PDF is more of a graphical representation of the music in fixed form, and Music XML helps with data interchange. And if you want to get it into another program to revise it, and we kind of, that's almost, we live and breathe that as you alluded to, but to make the wider world of our friends and colleagues in the library world aware was really good. So that was the tech fair. It was always exciting. And then, the things that I like, particularly going to MOLA, are often the technological aspects. And the opening plenary session actually was something called Broadening Access, Collaboration in Classical Music. And any thoughts, any observations that you had about that particular session?
I think it kind of built on a lot of themes that we have talked about in the performing arts and education, in my field of education broadly over the last probably 5 to 15 years, about making sure that the work that we're presenting on stage is more similar to the audiences, not only the audiences we have, but the audiences we want to reach, the audiences we wish we had
in the larger community.
That the composers that we're presenting are people that, for my students can relate to, that the audiences that come to our concerts can relate to, and some of the challenges with finding those works and presenting them in meaningful and sensitive and thoughtful ways, and of course the composers who were represented and the conductors who were represented as well. And that was a really interesting talk. I don't know the extent to which those conversations have been happening among music librarians, because I'm not a music librarian, but it was really interesting to hear it from that perspective, because I've been hearing it for some time in academia.
Yeah,
it's been very interesting. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. And, we're talking explicitly about diversity. We're talking about different perspectives, lived experiences, and bringing that into the arts and to the concert hall. And one of the points that was made, and I actually asked a question from the audience because I was very interested in, and they offered a very good response. The people that were on the panel, this was Eugene Rogers from the University of Michigan. He's also a chorus director with the Sphinx choirs. Carolina Heredia, she's a composer and the American Composers Forum administrator. And Andre Dowell from Sphinx was supposed to be there, but he got sick. And Ashley Lucas, another professor at the University of Michigan from the theater department, pitched in and really did a nice job bringing that perspective, which I enjoyed. But the thing that I wanted to prod and probe a little bit further was, a lot of times people have a great intention, great vision, and they want to commission a certain composer or someone, and we're not just talking about racial diversity or whatever. We're talking about diversity in all forms. Someone who may not have a lot of experience in the orchestral concert hall, but has a lot of other interesting ideas that they want to bring into that milieu.
Yeah, stylistic diversity.
Stylistic diversity.
Quite a bit. Yes.
It did, yeah. And so then so people do the commission and all that, and then there's this kind of mushy middle, like, okay, then they go off and create their music, and then it gets delivered to the library, and of course, you can't blame people if they're not experienced in that vernacular to exactly know, how are cues supposed to be formatted and what transpositions of the instruments are supposed to be and what are the specs, what is the instrumentation, what are the percussion instruments available, are there doublings, and all these things just kind of almost, sometimes get ignored because they don't know what they don't know. And we talked about that, and Eugene, he said, look, I work with composers of this nature all the time, and we have to assist them, and we have to do it early and not be shy about, giving that assistance, because it's only going to make, he said he's worked on projects where it's been a disaster, where you get the score and parts and it just, you can't perform from it. There's a practical reality of that.
And if you can't perform from it, then that work doesn't get performed and that voice doesn't get heard.
And it's a bad experience for everyone. And that's the last thing anyone wants.
And you want to encourage people to do more of this work.
Absolutely.
And so he talked a lot about just making sure that you're planning in terms of money if need be, but mostly in terms of giving more time to preparing these things. And the other thing that I really liked that Eugene Rogers pointed out, he's specifically talked about an experience performing Joel Thompson's 7 Last Words of the Unarmed, which is a beautiful piece. If you're not familiar with it, look for it on YouTube. It's fantastic. But one of the things that he talked about now, it's probably 10 years old now, but that under the current administration, there's a lot more scrutiny of performing arts and of universities. And those are places where government funding goes, and what kinds of things we can and should be saying about and with our music and our art form. And he talked about something that I've had to deal with at my university, that certain words we're not supposed to use on the websites. We're not supposed to use certain words in our syllabi and so forth. And he pointed out that just because we're not allowed to use those words doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be doing that work. If anything, that work is now more important. And finding ways to talk about it without using the magic words, or to just do it and not talk about it in the same ways at all, I think is really important. And I think as a person who just finished an academic year that was very hard for some of those reasons, I personally really needed to hear that. So it was really nice to hear.
That's great. It's always nice when you can come away from those sessions inspired and validated. And look, we went from there to, I would say, some more conventional music librarian topics, and one of them you attended something called the Many Hats of the Librarian. So tell us about the Many Hats.
The Many Hats of the Librarian was a very interesting session. It was Blaine Cunningham from Orchestra Iowa, Meredith Gangler from Eastman School of Music we mentioned earlier, and Matt Gold from the Richmond Symphony Orchestra. And it's one of the things that we talk about a lot when we talk about librarians is that they are musicians. And our friend Matt Dannon from the Air Force Band actually made a comment in this session that he's been trying to be very clear that when he uses the word musician, he means everybody. And then he's including not just the people who are making noises on stage, but everybody that's part of the organization is in almost every organization like this, but especially in the military ensembles, but even in non-military professional ensembles, the people in the library, a lot of the people at the administrative level, they're also musicians. And so using musicians a little bit more inclusively, and performers are the people that are on stage doing things. And a lot of the people in the library session, in this Many Hats session, are still performers, right? We mentioned Hank Skolnick earlier, but Blaine Cunningham is still the tuba player of the ensemble. Yeah. And he talked about the challenges that he experiences where he is the principal tuba and also the librarian, and he's on stage warming up for a rehearsal or a concert, and somebody comes up to him to ask him a library question, and he has to make sure. A lot of, I think, the balances of these different hats that librarians wear, a lot of it boiled down to communication with the other stakeholders about these are the times when I am doing this job, and I need to focus on this job because it requires focus and attention, and I can't do this other thing. And so he's had to find ways to clarify to his organization that this is the time that I'm doing principal tuba hat, and this is the time that I'm doing librarian hat. And in cases where there might be an emergency, a library emergency, while he's doing performer things, he has found ways to delegate small pieces of those to operations staff or other people who may be able to take on some library adjacent roles while he needs to focus on being a performer.
Well,
and probably, yeah.
I was just going to say that speaks to what we were talking about a few moments ago about the bus problem. And
exactly,
I mean, it behooves everyone for him to share that information and to delegate whenever possible, so that if someone does need to take it over, whether he's indisposed or just he's busy playing tuba,
right,
that the work of the library can go on.
And I think a lot of organizations, as they're seeing, we talked a moment ago about as organizations are seeing grant funding start to dwindle a little bit and government funding start to go in other directions. One of the things that they do is try to consolidate positions, right? And so we have a lot of librarians at the conference who are not just working in the library, but they are also doing some amount of operations or personnel or even marketing or ticket sales or development or like what anybody like, hey, here's a person that can operate an email account. And so finding ways for these very busy people to draw those boundaries between those different roles and communicate those to everyone else, I think was a really interesting conversation. So yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot of camaraderie going on in that room, and there was a lot of camaraderie going on really all over the place. As we said, the session that I was attending while you were in that one was something called "Permission to Play: Navigating Copyright for Today's Rehearsal and Tomorrow's Stage." And that was headed up by Liz Nowland, actually, the University of Michigan head performance librarian and licensing manager. And I should say, she, along with her library colleague, Megan Fisher, and the entire University of Michigan staff and team and faculty, along with Amy Tackett, and really everyone in the MOLA leadership has really just done a tremendous job with this conference. And I'm sorry that we'll have to miss the last day, but I'm sure we'll hear all about it if it goes as well as it has. Up to this point, it will surely be terrific. But she was actually one of the panelists on that session, and her colleagues from the university who specialized in copyright also joined her by the name of Raven Lanier and Jeremy York. They both work for the University of Michigan in the copyright office and related divisions of the university. And this is always a lively topic that draws questions and discussion. I actually was having a conversation with a librarian who maybe shall remain nameless, but he told me, he's like, I'm not going to the copyright discussions anymore. I've heard it all, and I've heard enough. But the thing is, with copyright, there's always more.
Right.
And it was interesting. They did solicit questions in advance, so they did kind of have a pre-programmed list of questions that they addressed, but then they solicited follow-up from the assembled audience on those questions and others. One interesting question that came up was acquiring and performing new editions of music that has entered the public domain. And the question is, what is copyrightable, what isn't? And does the librarian have permission to copy that new edition because it's not, the music isn't
right.
Under copyright anymore? And the answer is no, typically, because there is copyrightable material in that new edition, the stuff that's new typically is copyrightable, but not the underlying music. And we've seen this often that publishers or even other companies. I remember Scores Reformed, Steve Redding's company. They used to exhibit here at the MOLA conference for some time, and he and his partner Annie made a business out of basically looking at the dates of when copyright was about to expire, and then making new editions of those works. And the thing is, even though they don't have the rights to no one has the rights to the underlying music. No one can legitimately issue a sync license for a public domain music, the underlying music, in that they can sell and rent those editions, and because they're actually quite valuable, the work that they put into in terms of the scholarship. The thing is, a lot of these editions for many, many years, or a lot of this music that was under copyright, was just terrible. It was the music was bad. Those there were errors, the layout, the formatting, whatever it was. But because it was copyrighted, it was not in the public domain. Nobody could really legally make those changes.
Well, I mean, that's what it is. We've talked about this before. The copyright is a monopoly,
if
you have a monopoly, you can't. Nobody else can go anywhere else to get Bernstein. So you have to live with whatever the state of the materials is.
Yes, and so what would happen? And there's a whole committee. And Doug Adams, I believe, is still from the Baltimore Symphony. He's the head of that committee, and it maintains the MOLA errata database. And you would just have this list, and sometimes it was dozens of pages long for a piece, and then it was one for the score, and then one for all the parts as well, that circulated because librarians needed to know where all the errors were. And it was a difficult thing to realize, of course, that that's what they're doing. But then when the work goes into the public domain, someone that can endeavor to make a good edition can still sell that and rent it and copyright those changes. And so you can't use that copyrighted. You can't make a copy necessarily of that edition per se. So, but that was a gray area. I think a lot of people needed a little bit more clarification on that. And really, it comes down to what the market will bear for whatever work is out there, and that's a business decision that people make when they sell effectively public domain. People sell, and Raven made the point that people sell public domain material all the time, and legally you can, and it just depends on what the value and what you put into it and what people get out of it is. So one of the other resources that I learned about, actually, speaking of the public domain, Cornell University here in the U.S. in Ithaca has a really good resource about copyright term in the public domain, and goes through all the different lists of when copyright expired. Was it published? Was it not? Was the copyright renewed? Was it before certain changes to the Copyright Act? And that's kept up to date. That's a great resource that was mentioned in the session.
These ideas of the copyright on a new edition also came up in the session that I went to this morning on IMSLP, because famously IMSLP servers are based in Canada.
Oh yes,
and they follow Canadian copyright law, and so the idea of copyrights for newer editions of public domain works is very different around the rest of the world. And so that came up a little bit in that session as well. And Canada has a system, as I understood it from the panelists, that they follow whatever is the shortest copyright term in this group of nations copyright rules. And so that was somewhat interesting in that IMSLP session.
Okay. Yeah. Like I said, it's a topic that always comes up here, and there's always more. Another thing that came up was a question of arrangements. What is an arrangement versus what is a cover? And a novel theory that was floated, which is not recommended and really not accepted, was that an orchestral arrangement is a cover. And that's that's pretty well settled, but I think that grew out of the idea. It's like, well, wait a second, how come so-and-so, whatever artist can do a cover of somebody else's, piece that somebody else wrote, or a song, really, a pop song. And without getting into the details, but we made the case that when you do that, it's first of all expected that you're doing it pretty much adhering to the song as it was intended in that particular genre. Like if you have a pop song or a rock song or whatever, like you may depending on the subgenres of popular music, it may be different, quite like a country music versus an R&B or whatever. But you're still creating something basically commercial, pop music. And it would negate the value of an ASCAP or BMI license if every time somebody wanted to do a cover of a song with their particular cover band, which may have slightly different instrumentation or whatever from the original, that they would have to get an arrangement license.
Right.
That's why ASCAP and BMI and all the other PROs, PRSs exist. But the fact of the matter is orchestral arrangements are something very, very different. And the bottom line is to get permission whenever you can, and without going into all the details. But that was a lively discussion. The topic of compulsory licenses came up with recordings, and how come we don't have to get permission to make a recording, and that has to do with the first use. And once a commercial recording of a composition, orchestral, pop, whatever has been made, then anyone is legally allowed to make a recording, commercial recording of that without seeking explicit permission. They do have to seek a compulsory license, and the compulsory means that the copyright holder is compelled to give that license as long as the person that wants to make the recording pays the statutory mechanical royalties. And that's a very specific part of the bundle of rights. Of course, we spoke with Jim Kendrick all about that and the 4 factors and all these things. So some other ideas were floated. One of them that I found particularly interesting was the idea of some sort of a blanket license for sync licensing, like garden variety sync licensing, which is much more of a thing now post COVID. Somebody wants to put a video of themselves or their orchestra playing a piece of music, and really there's no blanket license system for that. They have to negotiate each one of those separately with the publisher, with the copyright holder. And, I don't believe there's anything imminent, but it was an interesting idea to think of it for that particular purpose.
Well, and it makes sense because obviously one of the reasons we have those compulsory licenses, those kind of automatic compulsory licenses, is because it's not practical for like every radio station who wants to play, whatever Dua Lipa song to license, to like enter negotiations with Dua Lipa's publisher. Like that's not practical. It's not practical for every person who's going to perform or record one of these works to have a one-off license. It doesn't scale for the lawyers at the publishing company even, right? They're not making enough money so I think that would make sense. Obviously, copyright law in general is very slow, and it lags behind the distribution technology that we have. And as it becomes, as you said, since COVID especially, more common for organizations, professional and non-professional organizations, to stream performances live, to leave archives on YouTube or wherever for a certain amount of time, if not in perpetuity. And so it obviously makes a lot of sense to figure out a way to do that in a way that's fair to the copyright owners and to support all the many benefits that everyone gets out of having those streams available and those recordings available on whatever streaming services. Yeah. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. It'd be very interesting to see if anything comes of that.
Yeah. I thought it was a good, at least proof of concept that was floated in that discussion. And we all know that the MOLA conference is the most important place for all these things to take place. But I'm obviously being facetious. But in reality, it is where the rubber meets the road. And we often see the librarians performing. You were talking about performing double duty. Often they are also the licensing man. In fact, Liz is also the licensing manager as well as the performance librarian, case in point. So they have to deal with these things. And
I can't wait to hear you testify in front of the Senate Commerce Committee.
Oh, yeah. Well, hopefully never. But one thing that I would like to hear you testify about in the 5 minutes that we have left is a little bit more about the IMSLP session, if there was anything else that you feel.
I went to a session this morning called Don't Sleep on IMSLP, which as you you suggested is actually a pun. It's a thing that I've heard several people refer to it as "I'm sleepy." It's what the choir director at my university refers to it as. Ryan Beacon calls it "I'm sleepy." I like to call it "imslip." So help me make imslip happen.
Okay.
Like
smooth.
Help me make fetch happen here. So imslip.
Right.
But anyway, IMSLP. This was a session that was kind of moderated mostly by our friend Bob Greer from the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, and also Elena Lentz-Talley from the Kansas City Symphony, and then Carl Simpson and Edward Guo from IMSLP were talking about IMSLP as an important resource for performance librarians. And I think it's probably not, that novel for us to go to IMSLP as, if not the first place when we're looking for scores or parts. It's certainly up there, especially when we're looking for public domain scores and parts. And certainly for me in education, if I want to use an example in class, that's probably the first place that I look. If I want to talk about orchestration in Brahms or something and how it's different from orchestration in Mozart, that's where I'm going to find my scores. I'm probably not going to walk over to the library and find a hard copy and then scan it and upload it to my students. That I'm probably not even going to download it from my IMSLP. I'm just going to send them a link or trust them to find it on their own. And so anyway, the idea that IMSLP is an important resource is not new. But what I think I didn't realize is how much really valuable metadata there is for the works that are on IMSLP. So obviously we can go and search by composer and look through their composer category page. But there's a lot of other really useful stuff there. You can find, for an individual composer, the works not only that they wrote, but the works that they may have edited in some capacity. For example, I did not know until it came up in the session that Brahms, and this is probably why I thought of Brahms as my example a moment ago, had edited a bunch of Chopin's music. And so when you look at the Brahms page on IMSLP, you can see as composer, big list of original works, as collaborator, I think there's one piece, as editor, there's another pretty significant list of works that he edited for, I should know. It probably is Bärenreiter. I'm not sure. But anyway, a big list of things that he edited. And so that was very interesting. That's awesome. Then also at the bottom, there's a bunch of other things. And if you are tasked with the responsibility of maybe filling out a program, maybe someone on artistic staff has picked out 80% of a program and they need the last thing that kind of fits the overall theme. There's a lot of little kind of category tags at the bottom of a page for a composer. So, if they're looking for something that is Norwegian or something like that, you might, find the category page for composers that are Norwegian and look at other things that are on there. There's a lot of really interesting ways that you can go through. And the other thing they talked about that's worth noting is contributions to IMSLP and how it's possible to contribute your own things to IMSLP with Creative Commons that are still under copyright, but also while maintaining the performance rights. So they have a special version of Creative Commons that they have created that's Creative Commons performance restricted. That's great. So, very interesting.
That's great. Well, listen, we're almost out of time here because the MOLA board, I think, is in this room next.
They're right on the other side.
They're right on the other side of the camera. So the other thing I'll just say real quickly is that I attended a session this morning called Freelancing, Working as a Personal Librarian, that was run by Laura Cones from the Indianapolis Symphony and Paul Beck from the Milwaukee Symphony. Both of them have done a lot of freelance work as well, and they talked about a lot of things in the freelance space. And rather than summarize them here, I spoke with Paul afterwards and said, hey, this would be a great podcast episode. So stay tuned in the future for Paul to come on and talk more about those things, because they apply not just to librarians, but also people working in the freelance department of any really job, composers, music preparation, and so on and so forth. So with that, we're going to bid you farewell from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the 2025 MOLA conference. David, my friend, it is always great to see you in the flesh, and this was fun. Let's do it again in Sydney.
Yes, I'm in.
All right.
I'm in.
Okay. Well, we hope to see you there or wherever you get your scoring notes fixed. Thanks for watching and listening, everyone. Take care, and we'll talk to you next time.